Everyone thought it was just a letter, a harmless piece of paper slipped into my mailbox on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. But when I tore it open, my hands started to shake. It wasn't a reminder. It wasn't a friendly notice. It was a threat. The homeowners association had accused me of violating rules I didn't even know existed. The words were dressed in polite language, but the tone was cold, sharp, and heavy. They warned me of fines, penalties, legal action, all because my grass was 2 inches taller than they thought it should be. At first I laughed. How could something so small be worth a fight? But then the laughter died, because it wasn't about the grass. It was about control. It was about power, and they had chosen me as their target. I remember standing on my porch that evening, the sun sinking behind the rooftops, the letter still trembling in my hand. Neighbors walked past, some smiling, some avoiding my eyes. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: fear. Not the kind of fear that makes you run, but the kind that makes you wonder if you even belong in your own home. But the real storm didn't come with the letter. It came with the knock on my door. 2 days later, I opened it to find a pair of men in crisp shirts, clipboards tucked under their arms. They didn't introduce themselves as neighbors. They didn't smile. They were inspectors sent by the HOA to evaluate my property. They walked my yard as if it belonged to them, measuring, pointing, scribbling, and every time their pens moved, I felt my chest tighten. I tried to speak. "Is this really necessary?" I asked. One of them looked up, eyes cold as glass, and said, "We're just doing our job." But I knew better. This wasn't about a job. It was intimidation. When they left, they didn't say goodbye. They just left a slip of paper tucked into my doorframe. Another violation, another fine, another reminder that they were watching me. And that night, lying awake in the dark, I asked myself a question I never thought I'd have to ask. Am I strong enough to fight this? The days that followed were filled with whispers. Some neighbors avoided me altogether. Others gave quiet warnings: "Don't push back, they'll make it worse." But deep down, something inside me was shifting. The more they pushed, the more I realized that giving in wasn't an option, because once you surrender your dignity, you never get it back. Still, doubt gnawed at me. These people had money, lawyers, influence. What did I have? Just one house, one voice, one choice: to fight or to give in. Then came the envelope. Thicker than the others, heavy, stamped with the mark of a law office I had never heard of. I sat at the kitchen table staring at it, my coffee going cold. And when I finally opened it, the words cut deeper than any fine ever could. The HOA had escalated. They were no longer threatening. They were suing me. My first instinct was to crumble, to think about selling the house, escaping the nightmare. But then another thought entered my mind, clear, steady, unshakable. If I walked away now, they would win. Not just against me, but against every neighbor too, afraid to speak. Against every family who just wanted peace but paid in silence. I folded the letter. I set it down. And in that quiet kitchen, with the weight of fear pressing down on me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. I was going to fight. And I had no idea how much it would cost me, how much sleep, how much pride, how many nights of doubt. But something told me, if I held my ground, the truth would rise. And when it did, the HOA would regret ever knocking on my door. The courtroom summons sat on my counter like a weight I couldn't lift. Every time I walked past it, I felt the walls closing in. How do you fight people who have the power to drain your savings, ruin your reputation, strip you of the very roof over your head? But fear has a strange way of turning into fuel. I remember the night I opened my laptop, hands shaking, searching for attorneys who had fought HOAs before. Every website I read seemed colder than the last: fees, retainers, contracts. The numbers made my stomach twist. Yet somewhere between despair and determination, I found one line on a local firm's site that gave me hope. "We defend homeowners against abusive HOAs." That was all I needed, a lifeline. The next morning, I sat in a small office with the smell of old books and coffee lingering in the air. Across from me sat a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried calm authority. Her name was. She listened without interrupting, nodding slowly as I laid out the story, the letters, the inspectors, the fines, the threats. When I finished, she leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "They picked the wrong homeowner." Those words lit a fire inside me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just afraid, I was angry. But anger doesn't erase the reality of war. The HOA unleashed everything they had. Legal filings stacked higher than my kitchen counter. Inspectors returned, cameras in hand, snapping photos of my lawn, my gutters, even the cracks in my driveway. Every little imperfection became ammunition. It was as if they were trying to prove that I wasn't just careless, I was unworthy of living there. And sometimes I almost believed them. There were nights I sat at the dining table, drowning in paperwork, my head in my hands, asking myself why I didn't just pay the fines and move on. Life would have been easier if I gave in. But then I'd look out the window at the house I worked years to afford. The porch where I drank coffee every morning. The yard where my kids once played. And I'd remember this wasn't just a house. This was home. And home is worth fighting for. The first court appearance was nothing like I expected. I thought it would be chaos, shouts, arguments, a clash of wills. Instead, it was quiet. Cold. A room filled with the shuffle of papers, the creak of benches, the low hum of voices too tired to care. But the moment the HOA's lawyers walked in, I felt the air change. Their suits were crisp, their briefcases polished, their expressions smug. To them, this wasn't a fight, it was routine. But to me, it was everything. When my attorney spoke, her voice didn't waver. She told the judge what the HOA had done, how they sent inspectors to harass me, how they piled fines to break me, how they tried to use the law as a weapon instead of a shield. The judge listened quietly, his expression unreadable. I searched his eyes for some sign, pity, anger, anything, but he gave nothing away. And then the HOA's attorney rose. His words dripped with arrogance, painting me as a careless homeowner who brought this on myself. He called me negligent, defiant, a disruption to the harmony of the neighborhood, every sentence cut deep. And for a moment I wondered if the courtroom believed him, if maybe, just maybe, I really was the villain in their story. But leaned over and whispered, "Don't flinch. Let them talk. The truth always sounds different when it's spoken without heart." She was right. Because as their lawyer droned on, something became clear. Their case wasn't about rules. It wasn't about community. It was about breaking someone who dared to say no. When the session ended, I walked out with my head high, though my knees shook with every step. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt sharper, the air colder. And yet deep inside, I felt something stirring. Courage. The kind of courage that doesn't roar but whispers, "Keep going. You're not done yet." That night, I sat at the same table where I had once considered giving up. Only this time, I wasn't afraid of the stack of papers. I was ready for them, because I realized something the HOA never expected me to see. Bullies only win if you stay silent. And I had no intention of staying silent. The real betrayal didn't come from the HOA's lawyers. It came from the people I thought were my neighbors. One evening, I stepped outside to take the trash to the curb, and I felt it, eyes on me, curtains shifting, porch lights flicking on as if to catch me in the act of existing. For weeks, I had wondered if I was imagining it. But that night, it was undeniable. Whispers carried down the street, low voices cutting through the still air. And then I heard it clearly, sharp enough to pierce. Why doesn't he just give up? That question haunted me, because it wasn't coming from strangers. It was coming from the very people I used to wave at every morning. People who once borrowed tools, shared recipes, laughed at block parties. Now they avoided me as if I carried something contagious. And maybe I did. Maybe I carried resistance, and that scared them. The HOA knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just want to break me with lawyers. They wanted to isolate me, make me the outcast. The lesson was clear: step out of line and you'll be next. But isolation does strange things to a person. Some nights it broke me. I'd sit in the quiet house, hearing nothing but the hum of the refrigerator, wondering if I was truly alone. Other nights, though, it hardened me. It reminded me that silence was the very weapon they relied on. One evening, I returned home to find another envelope taped to my door. This one wasn't from lawyers or inspectors. It was a petition, signed by several neighbors, demanding that I comply with community standards for the good of all residents. I stood there on my porch, staring at the signatures, people I knew, people I helped, people I trusted, And as the paper crumpled in my fist, I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go. They weren't just fighting me in court. They were poisoning the ground beneath my feet. My attorney told me not to let it shake me. "This isn't about them," she said. "It's about the truth, and the truth doesn't need a petition." But it did shake me, more than I wanted to admit, because sometimes fighting the system is easier than fighting loneliness. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal motions, depositions, and paperwork. The HOA's lawyers tried to bury me under mountains of documents, each one more intimidating than the last. They wanted to drain me, not just of money, but of time, energy, and willpower. But what they didn't count on was resolve. She tore through their filings like a storm, pointing out flaws, contradictions, and overreach. Every time I thought the mountain was too high, she carved a path through it, and slowly I began to see something I hadn't seen before. They weren't invincible. Behind the polished suits and cold words, they were desperate. Because if they truly had the law on their side, why fight so dirty? Why hide behind intimidation, inspectors, and petitions? One night after a long day of reviewing documents, I sat in the living room surrounded by papers. And as I sifted through them, a detail caught my eye. A small line in one of the HOA's filings, something about their authority to impose certain fines. The language was vague, too vague. I brought it to the next morning. She smiled, a rare, sharp smile. "Good catch," she said. "They've overstepped. If we can prove this, we can undermine their entire case." That was the first time I felt hope. Not just the fragile kind that flickers in the dark, but the kind that burns steady. Still, the battle was far from over. The HOA doubled down, calling emergency board meetings behind closed doors. Rumors spread that they were raising association dues to fund their legal war. Neighbors who once smiled now scowled when they saw me, muttering under their breath. The weight of it all pressed down on me, but deep inside, something had shifted. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was exposing them. Every threat, every violation, every fine, they weren't signs of strength. They were signs of fear. And one day soon, their fear would be laid bare for everyone to see. The deposition room was colder than I expected. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly glow. I sat at the end of a long table, hands folded tightly in front of me as the HOA's attorney slid a thick folder across the polished wood. His smile was thin, rehearsed, the kind that said he thought he had already won. He leaned forward. "Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory, sharp, meant to cut. I glanced at beside me. She gave the smallest nod. And then I looked back at him and said, as evenly as I could, "I understand the seriousness of yours." For a moment the room went still. He didn't like that answer. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his pen dug into the page as he scribbled notes. The deposition dragged on for hours. They asked about my yard, my fence, even the color of my shutters, as if paint could decide guilt. They twisted my words, tried to corner me, but every time was there, objecting, redirecting, steadying the ground beneath me. And yet it wasn't the questions that unnerved me most. It was the binder he carried. Because inside I knew were records, photos, documents, complaints. Evidence they had gathered from every shadow, every whisper, every petty rule. A war chest built not from justice, but from obsession. But what they didn't realize was that their obsession left cracks. A week later in her office laid out copies of the HOA's filings across the desk. She tapped one line, then another. "Here," she said, her finger pressing firmly. "This is where they overstepped. They issued fines without proper authorization, not once, not twice, dozens of times." I leaned closer, scanning the page. "So, all those violations." "Legally meaningless," she replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes gleamed with quiet fire. "If the judge sees this, their entire case begins to unravel." For the first time in months, I felt something heavy lift off my shoulders. Not victory, not yet, but the scent of possibility. Still, the HOA wasn't backing down. If anything, they grew more desperate. Inspectors returned again, this time photographing my backyard at night, their camera flashes cutting through the dark like lightning. Neighbors told me about secret board meetings where my name was the only agenda. Rumors spread faster than truth, that I was bankrupt, that I hated the community, that I was a danger to its harmony. The isolation deepened. I'd step outside and hear the sudden hush of conversations. I'd wave to people who once called me friend, only to watch them turn away. It stung. More than the lawsuits, more than the fines, because losing a community feels like losing a family. But here's what they didn't understand. Pressure doesn't always crush. Sometimes it forges. The next court date arrived like a storm on the horizon. I walked into the courthouse with my head high, though my stomach churned. The judge took his seat, the attorneys arranged their papers, and the battle resumed. The HOA's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth, polished. He painted me again as defiant, reckless, a rule-breaker who threatened the peace of the neighborhood. He held up photos, my lawn, my gutters, my driveway, as if they were exhibits of a crime. And then stood. Her voice cut through the room, steady and sharp. She didn't just argue. She revealed. One by one, she laid out the overreaches, the unauthorized fines, the intimidation tactics. She showed the judge how the HOA twisted rules, bent procedures, and used fear as their foundation. And with each word, I saw something remarkable, the smugness draining from the HOA's lawyer's face. At one point, the judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and asked a pointed question. Can you provide the bylaw that authorizes these fines? Silence. The HOA's attorney shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and stumbled through an answer that lacked the certainty he carried just moments before. And in that silence, a truth slipped into the room, a truth too sharp to ignore. They weren't just wrong, they were exposed. When the session ended, I walked out into the sunlight, my heart pounding. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the first crack in their armor, and once a wall cracks, it never holds the same again. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the streetlights flicker on, I realized something. The HOA had tried to take my peace, my dignity, my place in the community. But what they had given me instead was purpose. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The phone calls started first. Late at night, no caller ID. The kind of silence on the other end that doesn't feel accidental. At first, I thought it was kids, some prank. But after the third night in a row, when the call came at exactly 2:00 a.m., I knew better. This wasn't random, this was deliberate. Then came the letters, not official ones, not from the court or lawyers, anonymous, slipped under my door, taped to my car windshield, stuffed into my mailbox. Some were typed, some handwritten, all carrying the same message. Stop fighting. You're only making it worse. The words weren't threats, not directly, but they carried the same weight, a warning, sharp and suffocating. I remember standing in my kitchen one night, a stack of those letters spread across the counter, my hands trembling as I read them again and again. Was it the HOA? Was it neighbors? Or both? Whoever it was, they wanted me broken, scared, silent. And for a moment, I almost gave them what they wanted. But then I thought of every sleepless night, every dollar I'd poured into this fight, every drop of dignity they had tried to strip from me. And I realized something. If they were stooping this low, then I was closer to the truth than they wanted me to be. The next morning, I walked into his office with the stack of letters in hand. She studied them carefully, her jaw tightening. "They're rattled," she said. "This isn't strength, it's desperation." Her words steadied me, because deep down I knew she was right. The HOA had thrown everything at me, lawyers, inspectors, neighbors, and now they were turning to shadows. They were losing control. But desperation makes people dangerous. 1 week later, I got a notice from my bank. My escrow account, tied directly to my HOA dues, had been tampered with. Unauthorized withdrawals, extra charges. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But when I called, the representative said something that froze me. All these changes were requested by your homeowners association. They weren't just fighting me in court anymore. They were trying to bleed me dry. I sat at my desk that night, head in my hands, staring at numbers that didn't add up. Bills piling higher. Savings dwindling faster than I could keep up. And for the first time, I felt the weight of collapse pressing hard against me. Not just legal collapse, financial collapse. But just when the walls seemed ready to close in, something unexpected happened. It was a knock at my door, soft, hesitant. When I opened it, I saw a neighbor standing there, a woman I barely knew, someone who had always kept to herself. She looked nervous, glancing around as if afraid of being seen. Then she whispered, "I know what they're doing to you, and it's wrong." Her name was She, lived in the community for over 20 years. And that night, sitting at my kitchen table, she told me things I had only suspected. Secret board meetings where my case was discussed like entertainment. Votes held without proper notice. Funds from association dues funneled into the lawsuit against me. She slid a small stack of papers across the table, printouts, meeting notes, documents she had quietly collected. "You didn't hear this from me," she said. "But if you want to stop them, this is where you start." I stared at the papers, my pulse pounding. Evidence, proof of corruption, of misuse, of lies. And suddenly, the fear I had carried for months began to shift into something else. Resolve. Because now it wasn't just about defending myself. It was about exposing them. That night, as I sat alone with papers spread across the table, I realized how far the HOA had gone to crush me. They had called, harassed, drained, intimidated. But in their obsession, they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the power of truth. And soon, the truth was going to walk into that courtroom with me. The morning of the next hearing, I carried 2 folders under my arm. One held every piece of evidence the HOA had thrown at me, photos, letters, accusations. The other held something far more dangerous to them, papers. I didn't know if the judge would care. I didn't know if the truth would even matter in a system that often bends to money and influence. But as I sat in that courtroom, staring at the faces of the board members lined up across from me, I knew one thing for certain. They had no idea what was coming. The HOA's attorney opened as usual, voice confident, rehearsed. He painted the same tired picture, a defiant homeowner, reckless and disruptive, who refused to respect community rules. He spoke as if the outcome was already written. And then it was turn. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and sets papers on the table with a quiet thud that echoed through the silence. The HOA's attorney glanced at the folder, then back at her, his smile faltering. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about grass height or paint color. It is about abuse of power. Abuse by an association that has forgotten its duty to serve its residents. Abuse that we can now prove." She lifted the first document, a board meeting agenda that never went out to homeowners. Then another, minutes from a closed-door session where they discussed raising dues to fund litigation against me personally. And then, the sharpest blade of all, a financial report showing thousands of dollars siphoned from community maintenance funds directly into legal fees for this case. The judge's eyes narrowed. The board members shifted uneasily in their seats. The HOA's attorney objected, of course, called it irrelevant, claimed the documents were incomplete, unreliable, but didn't flinch. She pressed forward, her voice calm, her evidence undeniable. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw it, the crack in their armor widening. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. "If these records are accurate," he said slowly, "they raise serious concerns about the conduct of this homeowners association." That sentence hung in the air like thunder. Serious concerns. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something I hadn't felt in months. Validation. The HOA's attorney scrambled, his words tumbling faster now, less polished. He tried to pivot, to drown the room in technicalities. But the weight of the evidence lingered. And no matter how smooth his arguments, the truth had already found its way into the light. When the session ended, I walked out of that courtroom taller than I had walked in. Not victorious, not yet, but closer. Outside, the sunlight hit my face, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel harsh. It felt warm. But battles aren't won in a single strike. That night, as I reviewed the day's events, I knew the HOA would not go quietly. They would come back harder, sharper, more ruthless. Bullies never surrender without a fight. And I was right. The very next week, a new motion arrived, this time accusing me of defamation. They claimed that by spreading false rumors about the HOA, I was damaging the reputation of the board. It was a desperate swing, but still it stung. Because buried beneath their lies was the same strategy: bleed me, scare me, silence me. I showed the papers to who shook her head bitterly. They're cornered, and cornered animals lash out. Her words reminded me of something important. This fight wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone they had silenced, everyone who signed petitions out of fear, everyone who had paid dues without knowing where the money went. This was bigger than me. So I steadied myself. I gathered every document, every witness, every ounce of courage. Because the next time we stepped into that courtroom, I knew the truth wouldn't just flicker, it would blaze. And once a fire starts, there's no putting it out. The collapse didn't come all at once. It came in tremors, small cracks that spread until the whole began to crumble. It started with whispers. The same neighbors who once avoided me now lingered longer at their mailboxes. Some stopped me on walks, their voices hushed, their eyes darting around. "We didn't know," they'd say. "We thought you were just being difficult." And in their voices, I heard something I hadn't heard in months: regret. The HOA had ruled through fear for so long that silence had become the safest option. But once documents surfaced in court, silence began to feel dangerous. Suddenly, it wasn't me against the board. It was truth against corruption, and truth has a way of spreading. The next hearing was packed, not just with lawyers and board members, but with residents. People who had never once shown their faces in court now sat shoulder to shoulder watching. Some looked curious. Others looked angry, but all of them looked awake. The judge entered and the air shifted. The HOA's lawyer rose first, his voice louder than usual, as if volume could disguise panic. He tried to downplay the documents, dismiss them as irrelevant, insist that the board had acted within its rights. But his words carried less weight now. Because this time the room was listening, not just to him, but to what wasn't being said. And then stood. She didn't rush, she didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the facts, one after another, like bricks stacking into a wall no one could climb. Unauthorized fines, hidden meetings, community funds drained into lawsuits. Each point hit harder than the last. Then came the moment I'll never forget. She called as a witness. The room stirred as the quiet neighbor I had barely known walked to the stand. She looked small, almost fragile, but when she spoke, her voice carried steady and clear. She described the secret meetings, the pressure to stay silent, the way board members mocked residents behind closed doors, and with every word, the mask the HOA wore slipped further. The board members shifted uneasily, their faces tight. Some whispered to each other, their confidence unraveling. When finished, the judge leaned forward, his tone sharper than before. "These are serious allegations. The court expects full transparency moving forward. If I find that funds were misused or authority exceeded, there will be consequences." Consequences. That word landed like a hammer. For months, the HOA had been the one wielding it. But now, the hammer had swung back toward them. After court adjourned, I stepped outside into the crisp air and something unexpected happened. Neighbors, people who once crossed the street to avoid me, walked up. One shook my hand. Another clapped me on the shoulder. A third simply whispered, "Thank you." And in those moments, I understood something I hadn't seen before. This fight was never just mine. It was everyone's. I had been the first to stand, but now others were finding their voices too. Still, victory wasn't certain. The HOA was wounded but not finished. They scrambled behind the scenes, filing last-minute motions, clinging to whatever fragments of power they had left. And deep down, I knew their desperation would make the final act the hardest. That night I sat on my porch, the quiet hum of the street around me. For the first time, the silence didn't feel hostile. It felt alive, different, because now it wasn't filled with whispers of judgment. It was filled with possibility. I thought about every sleepless night, every threat, every dollar drained. And I realized something simple but powerful. They had taken almost everything from me. But in the process, they had given me back something even stronger. A voice. And I was going to use it until the very end. Because the final hearing was coming. And when it did, the truth wouldn't just whisper through the neighborhood, it would roar. The final hearing arrived like a storm you felt building for months. The sky outside the courthouse was heavy with gray, but inside, the tension was thicker still. I walked in with at my side, folders in hand, heart pounding. Across the aisle, the HOA board sat together, but they didn't look like the confident rulers of months ago. Their eyes darted, their whispers sharp, their shoulders tight. They knew this was the end game. The judge entered and the room fell silent. He didn't waste time. "We've heard extensive arguments," he began. "Today we will address the evidence and render a decision." The HOA's attorney rose first, his voice less polished than before. He argued desperately, clinging to the same story. I was negligent, disruptive, a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood. But his words sounded hollow now, echoes of a case already crumbling. Then it was turn. She didn't give a speech, she built a story. Piece by piece, she laid it all bare. The intimidation, the unauthorized fines, the secret meetings, the misused funds. She showed the judge how the HOA had weaponized rules not to protect the community but to control it. And as she spoke, the weight of truth filled the room until there was nowhere left for the board to hide. And then she did something that silenced even the whispers in the gallery. She turned, pointed at the board, and said, "This was never about paint colors or lawns. This was about power. Power abused at the expense of the very people they swore to serve." The judge's face was unreadable. He shuffled papers, adjusted his glasses, and then finally spoke. "The court finds that the homeowners association exceeded its authority in issuing fines and misused community funds in pursuit of this case." His voice was steady, but each word felt like a hammer striking steel. "The claims against the homeowner are dismissed in their entirety." Dismissed. The word rang through the room, echoing louder than any gavel. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Months of fear, anger, and exhaustion all surged at once, pressing against my chest. And then, slowly, it released. Like a weight I had carried so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The HOA's lawyer shuffled papers, his face pale. The board members sat frozen, their power evaporating in real time. And behind me I heard something I never expected in that courtroom. Applause. Quiet at first, then louder. Neighbors, residents, people who had once turned away, now clapping, standing, letting their voices rise. I turned and met eyes. She gave the smallest nod, her expression calm but proud. She had risked everything to speak, and now the truth had carried us both across the finish line. Outside, the gray sky had broken open into sunlight. I stood on the courthouse steps, people gathering around me, thanking me, shaking my hand. But in the middle of it all, I felt something deeper than victory. I felt peace. Not the fragile kind that comes from silence or avoidance, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground when it mattered most. That night, back on my porch, I looked out at the neighborhood that had once turned its back on me. The houses glowed softly in the evening light, children's laughter echoed down the street, and for the first time in months, it felt like home again. I thought about the long road behind me, the letters, the threats, the loneliness, the courtroom battles, and I thought about the lesson buried beneath it all. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud or glamorous. They're quiet. They're steady. They're found in the simple act of refusing to bow when everything around you tells you to. Because dignity isn't something anyone can give or take away. It's something you hold. And the moment you decide not to let it go, you've already won. The HOA sent lawyers, they sent inspectors, they sent threats. But in the end, all they did was make me stronger.